Since the majority of fantasy football players are no longer in the mix, we give you who's hot, who's not, with a look towards the future and not just the immediate one. Hey, how are you, folks? Jason Horwitz, glad to be with you as we head into Week 15 of the CBSSports.com Fantasy Football Series. This will be twofold. Hot not for guys that are playing well right now, but also in terms of looking at what they'll do for the future, as in next season. Their overall value. We'll continue that in move makers as well by looking at keeper league guys, and not so much the obvious ones as well. So all that to come, and then, of course, you can get this week's fix and start 'em, sit 'em to help you in your fantasy playoffs. But that later in the week. For now, let's bring in CBSSports.com senior fantasy writer Jamie Eisenberg from Miami to get into who's hot and who's not. And Jamie, let's start quarterbacks, as we always do. David Garrard, Matt Hasselbeck, they've been great the last few weeks. If you don't have Brady, Manning, Romo, would you go with these guys first?
Yeah, don't forget about Anderson, Favre, Ben Roethlisberger. Some of those guys have been great. But, Hasselbeck is on fire right now. There was some concern when Sean Alexander came back. Would they still be able to throw the ball all over the place? They did last week, 4 touchdowns for Hasselbeck. You're going to ride him as long as he's hot. And David Garrard continues to get better each week. He's finding, guys like Reggie Williams and certainly Matt Jones had a touchdown last week. Mercedes Lewis has worked in at tight end. So Garrard's playing well. If he's your best option, you use him.
Jamie, are those hot guys for next year as well as far as fantasy drafts of 2008?
I think Hasselbeck is, especially with the receivers that he's developed, with Deion Branch, assuming number 1 role. If DJ Hackett comes back, he's a free agent next year. Obviously, Bob Ingram is still a great guy. So I think Hasselbeck's going to continue to be a number 1 option. Garrard's sort of iffy. We don't know what the offense is going to look like next year with Fred Taylor getting a year older, Maurice Jones-Drew assuming more of a role. They are still a running team, but Garrard, he's proven himself to be a good quality quarterback.
And he's also developing a nice rapport there with Reggie Williams, who they finally are getting to come around here. Oh, what about Jay Cutler, Jamie? Last 4 games, with the exception of one of those weeks, he's been on a tear. What is his hot value for next year?
I think it's great. Of the 3 young guys coming into this season, it was Cutler, Matt Leinart, and Vince Young. And Cutler, I think, has established himself as the best pure quarterback in terms of fantasy production. He's going to be the best guy next year because Braden Marshall is a stud wide receiver. Brandon Stokely, they've signed for a 3-year extension. If they get Javon Walker back, that's only going to be an added bonus, especially with the running game getting going. So Cutler's going to be great.
What about Carson Palmer, Jamie? Because he hasn't been as high as people thought coming into this season. 9th among quarterbacks this year. Where is he for next year?
I think he's still in the top 10. I think he's fallen from the top 5, certainly from the top 3. It was a disappointment that he gets Chris Henry back, and they've almost taken a step backwards in their passing game. Chad Johnson had the big game, but they really haven't done much since that Tennessee game. So weather played a part, in that game against Pittsburgh, but last week was a little bit of a disappointment. I think he'll still finish the season strong. There's still great wide receivers there with TJ Houshmandzadeh, Henry, and Johnson as well. So they're getting the running game going a little bit. Rudy Johnson's finally healthy. I think Palmer will be fine, but again, I think he takes a step back now, certainly behind Romo, Manning, and Brady, maybe behind Breeze as well. And so, he's going to fall into that next tier of guys, from probably 6 through 10 next season.
And let's not forget, in Week 16, they also get the Cleveland Browns at home. And let's not forget, it was a 51-45 game earlier in the season. All right, Jamie, let's move on to the running backs. And Marion Barber, Ernest Graham, Ryan Grant, we all know those are hot guys to play for the next couple of weeks for the fantasy playoffs. But what is their value next season? Are they guys that you think about for keeper leagues?
I think they absolutely are. We're doing our draft looking ahead to next year, which I know you're a part of on CBSSports.com, so make sure you check that out to see some of the draft picks we've done. 2 guys who I picked are Marion Barber and Ryan Grant for that specific reason. Barber's probably going to be the number 1 guy in Dallas next year with Julius Jones being a free agent. I don't think they re-sign him, so Barber's going to be, get the majority of carries, which is what we've all liked to see going forward. Graham and Grant are 2 interesting guys because if Cadillac Williams does not come back to start the season, then Graham, you would assume, is going to be the number 1 guy there, which is going to add a lot of value to him. And then Ryan Grant, he may have to share some carries because they do have some young running backs in Brandon Jackson and Deshaun Wynn. But I think the way that Grant is proving himself to be right now, he's going to be a great running back, probably going to be the guy next year, and I think could be a definite number 1 fantasy running back to start the season.
Jamie, you talked about Cadillac Williams. Obviously, injuries have played a big role, as they do every season. But for fantasy backs, there have been a ton of injuries this season. What do you do with guys like Larry Johnson and Ronnie Brown as far as next year?
I think Larry Johnson should be fine. I think if the Chiefs were in the playoff race, you see probably Larry Johnson get back on the field a little bit sooner. There's no real rush right now. They're obviously dealing with some offensive line issues, some quarterback questions. Cam Brody-Coyle will be the guy. They have a good wide receiver now in Dwayne Bowe, still one of the best tight ends, Tony Gonzalez. I think Johnson, he's not going to be in the top 3 of running backs next year. I think he's still a number 1 quality back because he's going to get 25-plus touches. Hopefully he stays healthy next season. And then, looking at Ronnie Brown, it could be be an interesting situation because, as we see, the Dolphins are headed toward that #1 pick, and if Darren McFadden comes out, he's going to be probably the #1 overall guy. You can't pass up on him. So Minnesota has made it work with Adrian Peterson, Chester Taylor. I think the Dolphins can find a way to get Ronnie Brown and Darren McFadden on the field together as well. So I think Ronnie Brown still is a #2 fantasy running back, especially the way he proved himself this season, but his value is going to take a little bit of a hit if they do add a running back next year.
Well, he certainly did prove himself this past year when he was healthy, about 40 to 45% of the Dolphins' offense. Real quickly, Jamie, you talked about Jake Cutler earlier in this show. He's developed a great rapport with Brandon Marshall, 13th among wide receivers in leagues where you don't get points for catches. But what about Greg Jennings and a guy like Reggie Williams, who we mentioned earlier briefly? Where are they for next season as far as a hot knot type receiver?
Well, Williams, I think, is still going to be a #3 fantasy running back because he's much more of a deep threat than he is in every, down sort of receiver where he's going to go across the middle, going to get, 8, 9, 10 catches a game. But Marshall and Jennings are proving themselves to be great options, especially in those offenses with the quarterbacks that they play with. Marshall has really established himself as a #1 fantasy running wide receiver going into next season. And then Jennings, with Favre expected to come back in 2008, he is the #1 guy there, clearly. He's also going to be entering his 3rd season in the NFL, which, as we've seen throughout the history of the league, this is when wide receivers have their breakout season. So I think you'll see Jennings only get better, especially if Driver's still there and James Jones develops, which takes some of the pressure off him, where you can see some single coverage. But Williams, again, I think is a tier below those two guys.
All right, Jamie, thank you very much, sir. As far as which wide receivers those guys are replacing, we'll get into that in Move Makers and get your advice on which keepers not to take this year that those guys will replace. We'll talk to you soon, Jamie.
Looking forward to it, Jason.
Folks, that'll do it for this edition of Who's Hot and Who's Not. But for more, be sure to read all the articles coming from CBSSports.com and watch everything else on the CBS Audience Network. With Jamie Eisberg, I'm Jason Horowitz. Take care.